It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the network for this session. The title I've been given is Lessons Learned from Evangelism in the Balkans. What I will do is I'll try to give the context of that part of the Balkans that I'll be mostly referring to, and then I'll move to the lessons learned. Religious freedom in the last 30 years has provided an unprecedented opportunity for evangelism in the Balkans after 600 years. What I mean by this statement is that only after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the gospel has been preached freely in most of the Balkan countries in 600 years. For about 500 years, the Western Balkans especially, which is that region of the Balkans that I know best, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and Albania. This part of the Balkans was for 500 years under the Ottoman rule. And then for about 100 years, we were under atheist communist rule. And that's why I say for 600 years, the gospel was not freely preached in our part of the world. Now, the Balkans is a really huge territory. It encompasses many countries in between the Adriatic Sea and the Ionian Sea, the Aegean Sea, and then up to the Black Sea. I do not pretend to speak confidently about all of the countries that are part of the Balkan Peninsula, one of the three big peninsulas in Southeastern Europe. As I said before, I'm going to share mostly about lessons learned in evangelism from the countries surrounding Albania, Greece, North Macedonia, and former Yugoslavia. And I have deliberately been in constant communication with a lot of evangelical leaders and friends in these countries, asking questions of their experience with evangelistic efforts in the last 30 years. And the general feeling is that the evangelistic efforts in the Balkans in the last 30 years have been chaotic at best and have been culturally offensive at worst. Chaotic meaning all kinds of events with no real connection, no real follow-up, no real coordination have happened all over this region in the last 30 years. And culturally offensive, not meaning that the bad things of the culture have been challenged by the gospel message, but very often good things of the culture have unnecessarily been attacked by the evangelistic events in our region. Now, in spite of these less than effective evangelistic events, I am very grateful that God has blessed the proclamation of his word in our region. And currently, as a result, there is a growing church in many of the Balkan countries that I am referring to, including Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, especially Kosovo, since the war of a few years ago, and even in Serbia. In terms of evangelism, there has been growth in the number of events and also in the effectiveness of the evangelistic efforts. Now, in order to understand a little bit more our world and this part of the Balkans that I'm referring to, I would say that the Balkan presents a very complex context. What I mean by a complex context is, number one, we have both a glorious and a gloomy legacy, a glorious and a gloomy history. Our part of the world in the ancient times was considered to be the cradle of civilization. Of course, a lot of the sciences and the arts and philosophy were born and were developed in the Balkans. But that doesn't make the Balkan history as glorious as I believe it is. What makes our history glorious is the fact that the gospel of Jesus Christ came to our countries in the first century during the apostolic times. In Romans 15:19, the Apostle Paul says that he has fully preached the gospel from Jerusalem round about to Illyricum. And he is referring exactly to this part of the Balkans that I have in mind when I talk about lessons from evangelism in the Balkans. He's referring to the whole of Greece, North Macedonia, Albania, and former Yugoslavia. Now, besides having a glorious past, the Balkans, of course, has a gloomy past as well. The Balkans has been referred to as a powder keg. World wars have started in the Balkans. Winston Churchill has said, the Balkan produces more history than it can consume. And this goes to illustrate the complexity of our context. We exist in a difficult and diverse reality. The Balkans presents a difficult and diverse reality, first, because of extremism and the economic challenges at the present. Extremism in the form of nationalism has led to the most recent wars in Europe. Other big challenges that our countries face have to do with poverty and corruption. Poverty in general and corruption, especially in all leadership structures. And unfortunately, the church structures and religious structures are not excluded from the rest of the society. And then the diverse reality comes especially from the cultural and religious collisions. In these Balkan countries that I'm speaking about, we have a huge number of Orthodox, then Catholics and Muslims. So Greece, North Macedonia, Serbia, they would have, and Montenegro, they have a majority Orthodox culture. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania and Kosovo have a majority Muslim culture. And then in Albania and Croatia, of course, we have also the Catholic culture. So our context is really very, very diverse. And the challenges in evangelism that this religious plurality presents, the challenges are very obvious. People claim, especially those of a Christian nominal background, Orthodox and Catholic, they claim that for hundreds of years, they paid with their lives to remain Christians under the Ottoman pressure and to keep the faith under the communist pressure. And now evangelicals come and you say that we're lost, and you bring a message that says it's a good message, but based on the fact that the situation is really bad and we need to be saved. And so there's a lot of resistance because of that. And of course, Islam, being a totally different religion, raises its objections to the presentation of the gospel in our countries. However, and now I move to answering the question that I've been given, the lessons learned from evangelism in the Balkans. Except for presenting a very complex context, the Balkans presents a very compelling case for the gospel as well. First, the Balkans at present presents a real window of opportunity for the gospel to progress, to move forward. When Albania a few years ago joined NATO, not that I'm saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just stating a fact. Our prime minister then said that that was a miracle of freedom. In my view, what is a real miracle of freedom is the fact that evangelical churches are being planted and are free to grow in most of the Balkan countries that I am referring to. What is a real miracle of freedom is the fact that missionaries, evangelists, church planters, people can come to the Balkan countries now, and in a climate of freedom, they can preach the gospel and seek to win followers of Jesus Christ in our nations. That's the opportunity. We have freedom and we also have peace at the moment. There is also another advantage to the preaching of the gospel at this time in history. All over our countries, there is a sense of brokenness. Proud Albanians, proud Serbs, proud Greeks, proud anything you want to mention, are not as proud as they used to be at this moment in time. Most people in our countries have realized that we are far behind economic development, democratic developments, and all sorts of developments in comparison to other countries. So there is some desperation, but there is this deep sense of brokenness. And God is a master in fixing broken things. And broken people who are not arrogant and proud, are much more easy to reach with the gospel message than people who feel like they have everything, they don't need God, they don't need anything, they just want to enjoy life. Most people in the Balkan countries at this time know that they lack a lot. And so because of this, there is an openness for the gospel that is not true of the rest of the continent of Europe. So that's what I mean by saying the Balkans offers a compelling case for the gospel. It's now or never somehow. As our countries develop economically, socially, as they build strong democratic institutions, as they prosper, I am afraid hedonism and the other tendencies that we see in the rest of Europe, especially in Western Europe, they will also be present in our lands, and our people will not be as open to the gospel as they are now. That's why I say this is the time to have evangelistic efforts that learn from the past, correct the mistakes of the past, and do much better in reaching the Balkan countries with the gospel. In terms of reflecting from what has been done evangelistically in the last 30 years, I will just mention some of the things that my colleagues in the different Balkan countries have pointed out to me and that I agree with as mistakes made in the past. I don't want to spend a lot of time. I will just mention these items as mistakes of the past, and then I'll move on to what we have learned or what we can learn from what has happened so far evangelistically in the Balkans. So the mistakes made would include the disregard for culture. I mentioned this before. We are currently experiencing difficulties, but we are very well aware of our glorious past history. So there is no room for people coming to our countries and pretending to be the first gospel bearers and pretending to be the saviors of our people and our nations. Just to illustrate this mistake from my own country, from Albania, we don't need people to come and say that Mother Teresa is going to hell because she didn't believe your version of the gospel. Even if that is the case, why should somebody come and first thing they say when they open the mouth before an Albanian audience, they speak bad of one of the best ethnic Albanian people that, humanly speaking, has ever existed? So a disregard for culture is one of the mistakes. We have, I had the experience of a missionary who came to Albania, and he had composed his own song, which he was singing all over the country, very proudly. And the song literally said, "Oh Albania, you are dying without Jesus. We are coming with the gospel." And when my friends and I heard the words of this song, of course, we felt bad that we don't have a lot of Christians. And yes, people without Jesus are dying and are going to hell, but we didn't need some happy, powerful Westerner coming to sing with a guitar. If he really believed that we were dying without Jesus, probably he should have lamented and not bring that message through a very joyful song. The attitude of superiority has been a very clear mistake that has been made by those who have come to our countries to evangelize. And this attitude of superiority in my country has been, for example, demonstrated by the fact that in the late 90s, people were literally paying for helicopters, using helicopters to go to remote parts of Albania without knowing the context, without knowing the culture, without knowing anything, to show the Jesus film and to put people in front of a dilemma. If you want to go to hell, do not pray after me. If you want to go to heaven, raise your hand and pray this magic prayer after me. The lack of training has also been a problem in the past. A lot of people who have come have not necessarily been the people who would be allowed to share the gospel, to share a message, the gospel they could share, but to share a message in their own church. They come as theologians and church planters in my country, when in fact the local church that sends them never allows them to even preach for lack of training. So people who were simply available sometimes made it as evangelists instead of bringing people who are capable as well. The absence of follow-up as a result of independent initiatives to evangelize, and as a result of ignoring the locals and the churches that exist in these countries. That has been another mistake, because blaming the locals and the existing church for not doing the follow-up when you didn't ask them in the first place when you came to do evangelism and how you did evangelism, that would be easy, but I don't think it's the right thing to do. And a strong focus on methods. People coming with a very strong conviction that this is the way it worked in Dallas, so this is the way that it will work in Belgrade or in Tirana or Skopje. So these have been some of the mistakes that I think we need to learn from. And I will not spend any more time on this because I really don't want to be negative. As I said in the beginning, things have not been very, very good, but God has still honored the preaching of his word. And a lot of us, including myself, we have been converted to the evangelical faith because of the work of the evangelists and the missionaries that came from the West. What I'm trying to say is that we need to not turn a blind eye on the weaknesses that we have seen in the past, and we need to do our best to build on the strengths and do better. So what are some of the lessons that I would point out in terms of doing better in evangelism in the Balkans? And obviously, the lessons would be some of the opposites of the mistakes made. So first of all, I would say we need to be biblically humble and bold in preaching the gospel. We need to proclaim the truth in love. That's how I would translate the phrase, be biblically humble and bold. That means proclaim the truth in love. I really like to just put all the lessons that we've learned in context by just reading a passage from the Bible. I'm not going to preach on it. I'm just going to read it so that we are all reminded of the example of the Apostle Paul. In 1 Thessalonians, in chapter 2, I will read only the first 12 verses, and it will be very easy for all of us to see how all the lessons learned were really practiced by the apostles. 1 Thessalonians 2, 1-12 says, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother, taking care of her own children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." And this is just one example in the New Testament of how the apostle describes the way they evangelized from Jerusalem to Illyricum, the way they treated the people. Boldly, yes, but humbly as well, preaching the truth in love. We have a huge deficit in humility and love. As evangelicals, I think we tend to be so strong on truth and so weak on humility and love. And that presents a real problem to the preaching of the gospel, because people in my part of the world where I live tend to have a strong faith, even though they might not know a lot. So knowledge is not the most important thing for people in the country, in these countries. Love, care, and humility would win most hearts. So that is for me the most important lesson that we need to learn, to speak the truth in love. Secondly, we need to be prepared and intentional. The way I would translate this phrase is to say, pray, plan, proclaim. The Balkans is it's a complex context. It's not very easy to reach the hearts and minds of a lot of people who have suffered a lot and who are coming from a long history of conflict and confusion, and people using all kinds of tricks to change somebody's religion. This is a real spiritual warfare. And if we want to preach the gospel, if we want to evangelize these people, we need to really be intentional and prepared. Prayer, planning, and proclamation of the gospel. They should all three go together. Third lesson, I would say, we need to find a cultural entry point. We need to listen before we speak. That is what I mean by finding a cultural entry point. I think we do well before we go to any country, any audience, and before we open our mouth to speak, we do well to listen, to first know who we are speaking to, What are their concerns? What are their burdens? What are their challenges? What are their joys? What are their aspirations? What do they have that they hold dear and precious? And we know the gospel does confirm everything that is good. And it does also challenge and does also seek to remove anything that is not good. But most people naturally want to hold on to what is good and want to get rid of what is not good. Finding a cultural entry point requires a lot of listening, a lot of research, and it comes with humility. Third, be creative. By be creative, I mean use all moral, ethical, and legal means. We live in a context of freedom now. So if anything is moral, legal, and ethical, use it to win to win people. Become all things to all people. In my context, especially during the last year of the pandemic, we have used sports very, very successfully in evangelism. For some reason, we were not allowed to meet in person for any other activity, but they allowed for sports events to take place. So what we did is we organized the church league, we organized a lot of Christmas cups, Easter cups, a lot of sports tournaments to bring young people together and preach the gospel to them. So using arts, using music, using sports, this is what I mean by creativity, drama, anything that is moral, ethical, and legal. Train believers to witness. Personal and public evangelism. Now, this is so important. Of course, God has given some the gift of evangelists, but we are all witnesses. There is no excuse for us not to train every believer to be a witness, to know how to share the gospel. We're not making them evangelists in the sense of people who will preach in public events. Not all believers have that calling or that gifting, but all believers have a story to tell, their life story. They all should know what the gospel content is, and they all should be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in them. So teaching evangelism to everybody and not to just a few specialists, that is key in evangelism, because most people in our context have become believers through personal relationships. At the workplace, at school, at university, Christians who have understood that they are witnesses, even though they might not be good public speakers or preachers or evangelists, people who have understood that they are responsible to witness, they have been very effective in bringing others to Christ. Be relational. That means take a process approach. People in our countries are very skeptical, and gaining somebody's trust takes time. Why should someone just decide to change their religion just like that because they hear a good argument or a good presentation from somebody they have no idea who they are, where they come from, and why they have come to speak to them? We have what we call a coffee culture. Most good things, unfortunately, in our countries happen at the coffee shop, not in the office. Most of the work is done around the coffee table. We are very relational, and it's a process in most cases for people from the Balkans to become evangelical believers. The pressure and hurry and trying to make instant Christians doesn't really work in our context. The say the prayer after me and then you're going to heaven doesn't really mean much to a lot of the people. I have the experience of interpreting for evangelistic teams that came from the West in the early 90s. And after they had offered people to pray the prayer so that they don't go to hell, but they go to heaven, the next thing they said to them was, okay, now you need to find a church, and next Sunday go to meet with a group of believers in the church. And immediately those same people who prayed the prayer said, how should I find a church? I'm a Muslim. Or I have a church, I'm an Orthodox, or I'm a Catholic. So it's a process. And it's very relational, the way we reach people in this part of the world. I think it's true in most of the world, but especially in our countries where people have this inherent mistrust of other people. We need to gain the right to speak to our audience. It doesn't matter that we have the best message in the world. If they don't trust us, they will not trust the message. Last, create synergy and provide follow-up. Work in teams, work together. It's amazing how in the New Testament, all the missionary trips that Paul was on, he was never alone. He's always with a team. Everything that is good happens in teamwork, happens through synergy, through people working together, through coordination and planning together. And so it's very important to seek to work in partnership with the people and the churches that are already in place if we are going to use this window of opportunity for bringing the gospel to the Balkans. In conclusion, I would say the gospel, yes, is the only true hope for the Balkans, but gospel preachers should really bring the gospel in the way that doesn't just transmit knowledge and the message, but transmits a life that is really more than the words, that is evangelistic, a life that is evangelistic more than the words themselves. The Balkan Church needs effective partnerships, which means, yes, there is a church in the Balkans that is doing evangelism, but the Balkans is still a missionary field. And I speak on behalf of a lot of evangelical leaders that I know from our countries, we would welcome any church, mission agency, or group that wants to partner with us in bringing the gospel to our countries.